Hey guys, welcome back and hello if you are new. So thank you so much for tuning in. Something a little bit different from me this time. So previously, as you guys know, I worked with Metal Sucks and I was very kindly asked to join their panel of, I think it was about 180 people who would essentially pick 25 of their favourite albums and the top albums of the last decade. With that in mind, it kind of gave me the idea that maybe it might be interesting if you guys saw my personal choices. Obviously the final list was, a collaboration of a lot of other people. They're in here for various reasons. It could be the height of the band's work. It could be that, the album had a cultural impact, really. And, that it began a movement or, anything that is truly out of the ordinary. So without further ado, let's get started and dive headfirst into my albums of the decade. So kicking things off are one of my all-time favourite bands, Opeth. Now, the reason I chose Heritage over so many other albums is that I find that Heritage was a truly dividing album. This was where Opeth separated their camps into the people who love death metal and the people who love prog rock. Thankfully, I fall into the two categories, and there's quite a lot of people that do. Especially on the comments from my last Opeth video and various other things. It's really cool to see just how accepting people are. Heritage was the first album to showcase Opeth's new prog rock style to the metal community, and it did very much come under fire. But for me, I think it's an important album for Opeth because not only did it usher in this new era of Opeth that we're in now, but it showed that the band really create music that they enjoy. And I think that is how Opeth really began. And if you didn't let the band create music that they would enjoy, we wouldn't have the masterpieces of Ghost Reveries, Blackwater Park, Still Life. And I think to try and restrict that creativity is just not fair. Heritage showed that Opeth wanted to create music on their own terms, but most importantly, spawned this new era of prog rock for the band. And I would argue probably got a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have listened to prog rock into the first place. So I think it's an absolutely fantastic album, and that's why it's on this list. Now, Periphery's self-titled, arguably the record that kind of spurred on the gent movement, which although was created by Meshuggah, it was popularized by Periphery. And for me, I think that this was where, particularly, the idea of gent and the more progressive angle of Periphery saw more technicality be introduced to even more of a mainstream audience. Of course, we've always had tech death and the various bands there, but I think that with Periphery, the band really kind of not only created their own sound, but also were able to showcase a different kind of technicality. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that it is so important. It was also a big album for me because I think it really threw me into the world of, Animals as Leaders, Veil of Maya. And, I mention these bands, but they're all somewhat stemmed from the same group, Tesseract as well. And they all have that common sense of rhythm. And it would pave the way for them to become one of the most important bands in the new progressive metal movement. And not to mention, it's an outstanding record and put Periphery on the map as the genre's big hitters. You really can't fault this album. There's so many dynamic ranges in Spencer Sotelo's voice. The guitars come in with 3 guitarists, I might add, which was quite special. And then you've just got such an interesting sound that I don't think really was kind of populated, aside from Meshuggah, obviously. Sentence to Life is one of the grooviest albums I've ever heard, And I remember picking it up, I think it was around March in 2012, and every dynamic works brilliantly. You know, the band understand exactly when to push forward and pull back, and they create really catchy 3.5-minute songs that just make you want to punch your fucking fist in the air. It's so good. And it's an album that I can never ever sit still listening to, and still to this day I absolutely love when that initial fucking blast comes in right at the beginning of the album. And it's just a really fun record. And again, you know, that's why I've put it in this list, because I do think that for me it was not only a very important record, but also just one that I have always gone back to, and really has that element of, you know, timelessness that we've seen on the likes of like Left Hand Path or Clandestine by Entombed. The reason I've chosen this album is because it's potentially one of the most cinematic releases I've heard this decade, and it's a very emotional album. I think that there are many different peaks and troughs, but for me it also represents a band that truly understand the journey that a listener goes through when listening to an album. I think that it tells a beautiful story, and there are so many little nuances that you can kind of keep coming back to that you would never have heard before. If you don't believe me, it also won Prog's lauded Album of the Year award in 2017 when it was released. And ever since then, it's always been my go-to Sunday album, you know, like a really chill record where the sun's out but you can just kind of relax. Now, Cult of Luna and Vertikal. So for me, Cult of Luna's existence was one that I kind of didn't really even know of until about probably 3 years ago. Obviously I was aware of them, but I never really listened to them. And then I really fell down the Cult of Luna hole. It all started with Mariner, but I have to say, Vertikal for me has that black and white chromatic Metropolis feel that they were going for. And I think that that is really what sets it apart from some of the other albums that Cult of Luna have done. I love the fact that it features the idea of industrial cities, factories, and these very mechanical electronics and keys that really create that sense of a story as well, actually within the album. And it's become one of my favourite records to play in the last sort of 3 years. It's an absolute masterpiece, and again, you know, it really does tell a story, and I think that's probably one of the most important elements for me in an album. It doesn't necessarily have to be a concept album, but if the album has peaks and troughs and it follows with different movements, then I think that is truly what makes you engaged in a record. And Vertikal was, you know, the next step that would move to their more space-oriented style in Mariner, but it was very much grounded at the same time. And for me, that is one of the reasons why it is one of my favourite albums of the last decade. So this has only been 5 of my choices so far. There's still 20 more to come, so please do make sure that you tune in. I'm going to upload one of these videos every week until we finish. And then by that time, it will be time for the Album of the Year list 2019, which is also one of my favourite times. Please do leave a comment. There are so many more amazing albums coming up, and there might be some that you're incredibly familiar with and others that maybe you don't even know. Either way, let's have a chat down in the comments section, and you can talk about, you know, if you even know these albums or what your experience has been with them. I'd always love to hear your thoughts as well, not just mine. So, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed my choices. Please do hit that like and subscribe button if you can. Any shares are always appreciated. And I will see you next week for the next lot of my albums of the decade.